Okay, folks, welcome back to Shadowlands. So, I'm not sure how to classify this, if it's a state of, beyond 60, theory crafting. I'm going to cover a little bit of everything. It seems natural to start with rotation. However, to understand the rotation, you have to see what talents I've taken. And to a lesser extent, I suppose, why I took them. So, we're going to start there. I've done uh, World Quests, I've done the Covenant campaign, I've done Mythics, I've done a little bit of everything. Um, I've played with things all along. So I've gotten to see kind of how everything works in different settings, if you will. So, if we look at the spell book first, just to cover the abilities, they went back to giving you a little bit of each theme. So you have some arcane abilities, some frost abilities. You don't have arcane missiles. You do have arcane explosion. And I believe that's it for the arcane abilities. And then you have Frost Nova, Frost Bolt, as far as your DPS abilities, and then of course Ice Block. Um, yeah. Arcane Explosion you can't really use because it drains your mana too much if you just spam it. It has some niche uses. In dungeons, there were uh, some fights, mob pulls here and there that it kind of comes in useful. However, that being said, I don't have trouble spamming my fire abilities, my AoE abilities. So you don't really ever need to use this, which is kind of disappointing, I suppose. You also have to be in melee range, which isn't great. It's nice if you're running older content, you can pretty much just one-shot most everything. Um, Frostbolt works great as a slow, or for the slow. Um, it doesn't synergize with anything um, as far as your fire ability, so it won't, if it critical strikes, you won't get a hot streak or anything like that, of course. Um, which is strange because let's see if it's here. I was gonna say Mage has or has had Frostfire. Thought it was Frost Mage that had the Frostfire ability. So there is a theory where this could have synergized with your fire abilities. However, in its current state, it does not. It does not do a lot of damage. It was helpful leveling to slow enemies when I was less geared and could die more easily. Um, Other than that, that is your baseline abilities. And then for your fire abilities, pretty much what you'd expect. Lots of red. Pretty much not too much different there. They've more or less left fire alone. Um, Altered Time, we got back in the last expansion, I want to say, in Battle for Azeroth, is worth mentioning. It doesn't work like it did in Mists of Pandora. It basically does the same thing, except for it doesn't copy your buffs. So if you were to use Combustion, let's say, and then you were to use alter time and everything expired and used alter time again, it's not going to proc your combustion again. Um, that said, it does have somewhat of a niche use because it will return you back to the spot you first used it and to the health you had when it was cast. So for Mythic Dungeons, some boss fights, this can come in handy if you're trying to move out of the way of mechanics and different things like that. And with your returning you to the same health as well just kind of makes it a little bit better of an ability. That said, I don't use it nearly as much as I did the first time it was in the game. So looking at talents now, as I said, I have done the Covenant campaign, I've done Mythics, I've played around with the talents, mostly doing one of those two things. And this is a setup that seems to work the best so far. So, Pyromaniac gives you a 8% chance to instantly reactivate Hot Streak. So basically makes Pyroblast or Flame Strike instant cast again. Firestarter does extra damage basically while your target is above 90% health. Searing Touch does extra damage through Scorch, or allows Scorch to do increased damage, do more damage, if your target is below 30% health. So, Firestarter really isn't practical in Mythic Dungeons. Your target doesn't stay above 90% health very often. This would be more of a raid ability. I would think you would get more use off of it that way. Even bosses in Mythic Dungeons typically don't stay above 90% health all that long. Searing Touch, one, I don't use Scorch that often. It just doesn't do a lot of damage. You can cast it while moving. It's more of a PvP ability is the way most fire mages use it. I have seen some use it in Mythic Dungeons, just not that often. Just not a lot of fire mages. So this just really has no... And again, by the time you get to 30% health, the target dies so quickly anyway, usually. The only kind of neutral choice for any given situation, or your default choice, would probably be Pyromaniac. The 8% actually procs quite a bit. Surprisingly, considering that you have abilities that have cooldowns that can grant you Hot Streak, and that Combustion has a 2-minute cooldown and a 12-second duration, you actually get quite a bit of use out of this. So, I actually missed it when I was playing around with other things. So, I had Blast Wave for the next tier, for PvP mostly. What I would typically do, it has a knockback. You can get around that if you use Frost Nova first. It does AoE damage, which is why I had it for... the knockback was actually what I had it for in PvP. Not much use in PvE in Mythics. So I switched to Blazing Soul for now, just to keep Blazing Barrier up longer. I was having or I felt like I was having issues with keeping my health up. So being able to keep Blazing Barrier up, when you use Blink, it uses Blazing Barrier whether your actual ability is on cooldown or not. So you can actually just save this for when you need to refresh your shield, basically. And if you use Blink as much as I do, most mages do, this is part of their rotation. One of the few times a utility is part of your rotation, usually. Um, that's why I have it on my main bar with my DPS abilities. You won't have any problem getting use out of this. So being able to have an extra shield, basically an extra charge of that, is worthwhile. I think Shimmer basically does the same thing as Blink. It just allows you to cast an ability while you use it. Also has 2 charges. I don't know any mage that has ever taken this that I have ever seen. So I'm not entirely sure what it's actually good for. If there was a raid fight maybe, or even a mythic dungeon fight where movement was an issue, I could see maybe taking this. There's really not. As long as you basically don't stand in anything, so to speak, generally speaking, for mythics, you're usually okay. Any other mechanic, you usually just have to focus ads or, follow a mechanic or something. It's not really too much of an issue. Then the next here, so the big thing here was Rune of Power. When Shadowlands came out, this was one of the featured things. They made Rune of Power a on target, or on location ability, excuse me. I've played with this. The 1.2 second cast time, kind of, if it was instant, I feel like this would be better. You waste at least, a second casting this to do more damage. That may sound a little like splitting hairs. On a 45-second cooldown, there was just kind of a coordination issue with it. Casting Combustion will also create a rune at your location, which is good. However, you generally don't use Combustion other than on a boss fight. At least I don't, because you want it available for a boss fight, so you can do your kind of burst damage. Incanter's Flow, for me, works perfectly fine because it's constantly cycling through. So on mob fights, boss fights, whatever you're doing, as long as you're doing damage, this is cycling through. There's not a big disadvantage between when it cycles down and it cycles up. You can kind of just let it do its thing, kind of just set this as your passive and then forget about it. You don't have to do anything else, and I like that about it. In that way, it's a simple ability. Focus Magic increases the target's chance to critically hit with spells by 5% for 30 minutes. When the target critically hits your intellect, and chance to critically hit with spells is increased by 5% for 10 seconds. Cannot cast on self. Just kind of I would say an oddball ability. I don't use spell steal all that often. I'm probably a terrible mage in that way. I just, half the time I don't think about it, or half the time I'm not coordinated enough to steal the ability that I wanted. So trying to use something like this is just kind of in that same category for me. It's kind of a coordination issue. It's going to be something I'm going to take, and I'm just never going to think to use it. Um, so as I said, Incanter's Flow, you can kind of set it and forget it. It does its thing regardless. There's not really a good or bad time for this um, to use its effect necessarily. Of course, you want the 20% as much as you can, but cycling back and forth, I'm already doing that with Ignite, which is the mastery for Fire Mage. So it's not as though I'm not used to having to build up damage. So this, I would say, would probably be the default. And I've really, honestly, never seen... I've been in several Mythics with other mages, and I've yet to see anyone take this, and I'm pretty sure it's available in all 3 specs. So if that tells you anything. Incanter's Flow was a bit of an underdog. At one point, there were some other talents mixed around in here. I'm pretty sure Focus Magic was something else, and I think Rune of Power was somewhere higher in the talents here at one point. And nobody took it. And I took it. I can remember taking this in Warlords, I want to say. And yeah, it works perfectly fine for what it does. It's a good example of a passive that is somewhat simple, does what it's supposed to do. You don't really have to use anything in combination with it. You don't have to do anything outside your normal rotation. It's there as you're doing your rotation. The next tier is one that took a little bit of looking. So Flame On and they all kind of do something different, yet they all kind of do something the same. So Flame On is what I took. Reduces the cooldown of Fire Blast, which is your main ability for proccing hot streaks. So that's good. And increases your maximum charges to 1. Alexstrasza's Fury increases the critical strike chance of Dragon's Breath and increases the chance for a hot streak, which is good. And also increases the damage of Pyroblast and Flame Strike, which is also good. I used this, I think this is what I started out with for PvP. Dragon's Breath I actually use quite a bit because it does damage and it has a disorienting effect. So this is a really good... I'm not usually a fan of kind of frontal cone abilities because I feel like I'm always missing a target, so I'm not getting the full damage effect. Dragon's Breath I actually like. It's really simple to use. You just have to move in a little closer, use it, and then they're disoriented, so you don't have to worry about like blinking or turning around and running away or anything. You can kind of in those 4 seconds you can put down a flame strike. You can do different things, whatever you're trying to do, depending on when it is you use it. You can disorient a flag character if you're in PvP on the right map, what have you, or even if somebody's guarding a base. I mean, there's just a lot of appropriate uses and kind of niche uses, I'll say, you can use it for. The cooldown's not terrible. If they did anything, I think if they lowered the cooldown to maybe 15 seconds, I think it would be a little better. 18 seconds is a bit of a weird time, in all honesty. You can leave the damage, leave everything else, just lower it maybe to 15 seconds. I think that would be kind of... I think that would be kind of neat, just to be able to use it just a little more often. I maybe only use this a handful of times, if that, in any given situation, and the cooldown is one of the reasons why. And then from the ashes, this is where I believe Phoenix Flames was at one point. I can't remember if it was... I'm pretty sure that's the way it was in Legion. I'm not entirely sure for Battle for Azeroth. I think it was still a talent. This was your artifact ability in Legion. So yeah, so it would have had to have been in Battle for Azeroth, because we went through Legion. What am I saying? We went through Legion, then we went to Battle for Azeroth. So yeah, so it was a talent here in Battle for Azeroth. They changed when they made a lot of the artifact abilities talents. They left them more or less unchanged. They did make a change to Phoenix Flames in that it no longer is a guaranteed critical strike. Used to be just like Fire Blast. And it was always a guaranteed critical strike. So you essentially had 5 charges if you didn't take Flame on, because you would have taken Phoenix Flames instead. So you had 5 charges that could all critical strike. And it sounds a bit overpowered. It actually kind of worked, because everything had a cooldown. Once those 5 charges were used, you had to either use Combustion and spam Fireball or something else. You weren't getting the 2-second reduced cooldown on, or recharge, cooldown, recharge, essentially the same thing, on Fire Blast, because you didn't have Flame on. So this had 25 seconds, this had 10 seconds. Like, you had to wait to use this if you used everything at one time. They made it baseline in Shadowlands and just took away, gave you the 3 charges. It does everything it did before. It just doesn't have the critical strike effect. They also added it to your mastery. And it actually took me a second to realize this, I will admit. So Ignite works like it did. They just tacked on that Phoenix Flames spreads Ignite to 8 nearby enemies. So they just gave it a cleave effect. So it basically does, in effect, what Living Bomb does. It does initial damage, which is pretty decent, and then whatever your Ignite is at, it will spread that to other targets. And I actually didn't realize that. I was using this first because if I was using Combustion, for some reason I was thinking it made more sense to use Phoenix Flames first. It does with Combustion because it doesn't have a critical strike effect, of course. And then you can use Fire Blast, so if Combustion expires, you're still going to get use of if you have a hot streak. For some reason, on mob fights, I was using Phoenix Flames first, and then I was switching over to Fire Blast, I guess because it had the longer cooldown. Then when I realized that it was spreading Ignite, I would start with Fire Blast, and then use Phoenix Flames to help spread the Ignite. And then my damage went up. A noticeable amount. So it's like, okay, so I was kind of doing this backwards. So from the Ashes, increases your mastery 2% for each charge of Phoenix Flames off cooldown. And direct damage, critical strikes, reduce cooldown by 1 second. No, there we go. So it's a bit of a weird ability. To have an ability off cooldown and to increase the cooldown of that ability. I don't know why you would do this. I can't figure out. Most every fire mage I've seen has flame on now. Um, as I said, Alexstrasza's Fury is pretty good for PvP. I would definitely recommend this for PvP. Um, from my own experience. Flame On is also a decent choice for most situations. Uh, this from the Ashes, I cannot imagine a time when you would use this, unless you wanted like Living Bomb or something like that, and you just wanted to use something else in its place. And 2%, it only ends up being like a 6% increase if you have all 3 charges on cooldown. That's not a great deal. That's not a large amount. I like the fact they were trying to, when they took it um, off the talents, they tried to put something in its place that would work with it. I like that idea. Um, this just doesn't make much sense for much of any situation you could think of. If it was if it was a percentage based on your ignite, um, or if it was just a higher percentage, maybe 3%, that would be about 9%. I would think that's a little more decent. So as it stands, either Flame On or Alexstrasza's Fury, I would think, depending on what you were trying to do, based on your preference. I think that's kind of how you would sum this up. It's pretty well based on your preference and how well or how often you would use Dragon's Breath. I think that's fair to say. Yeah. The next here is pretty straightforward. Took Ice Ward. I like Ice Ward quite a bit. Gives Frost Nova 2 charges. I actually use Frost Nova quite a bit. It's good to have some CC, especially in Mythics. This helps, or I try to use it to help the tanks if the mobs are kind of scattering. Having 2 charges is pretty worthwhile in PvE and PvP especially. I think that's why I took it, was for PvP. Had Ring of Frost for the longest time and just never used it. And then the times I did use it, I don't know if I wasn't using it correctly or if it just didn't work that well at the time, because this goes back to, again, I think it was Warlords was when I first remember using it. I think if I remember correctly. Frantic Speed increases your speed when you use when you cast Scorch. Don't use Scorch, so this this just doesn't really have. It's a bit of an odd ability considering what it's in with. 2 CC abilities and then a movement ability. Movement speed increase ability. So Ice Swords, I think some mages do take Ring of Frost. I don't know how well this works in raids and certain raid fights where you have to CC mobs and different things like that. Ice Swords, you do have to be in melee range. Ring of Frost, you do not. It is a on location ability. I think it's always been an on location ability. I don't think there was ever a time when you used it and it just went down where you were. It seems like there was, though. Not entirely sure on that. But as far as I can remember, it's always been kind of an on-location ability. So Ice Wards, I would say, would be the default here, unless for some reason you were really insistent on taking Frost Ring. Some mages love this. It's one of those abilities that the effect sounds really good until you try to put it into practice. So you try to use it and then you realize it's a bit different than what it leads you to believe. I think that's fair to say. Of course, anyone in PvP that has ever stepped in this and got frozen will know the aggravation that this can cause. So it may be that thinking through kind of the differences, this may be one that works maybe a little better in PvP. Um, it's one of those abilities that it kind of just is your personal preference. They're both CC abilities. One's not really a bigger advantage over the other one, I would say, other than the fact that Ice Ward is more of a melee and Ring of Frost is more of a on location ability. And then the next here, so this one is one that's been been a bit of a bane for me for several expansions now. Played around with this one quite a bit. I had Living Bomb to start with, which basically does damage and then has a cleave effect. Um, and I like Living Bomb. I liked all the bomb concepts that they had. They had one for each spec, themed to that spec in Mists of Pandora. And I believe they all became talents. I know Fire and Arcane did. I think Frost did. I'm not 100% sure. They went away and then brought them back as talents. And this is pretty decent ability. It's a neutral ability for most situations. It'll do single target damage. It'll do AoE damage. You don't have to... you don't feel like you're losing out between AoE fights, AoE mob fights, and single target boss fights. I took Flame Patch, though, because with Phoenix Flames, I already had enough abilities. And I couldn't figure out how to work Living Bomb and Fire Blast, Phoenix Flames, the instant abilities all in together. It just... I had it in place of Meteor. And that worked fine. That was a more fun setup to have if you just wanted to mess around. You can use Living Bomb every 9.7 seconds. So if you weren't worried about doing like higher end or more end game content, if you weren't going to do mythics, raids, what have you, you could probably take Living Bomb and be fine with most anything you did. I took Flame Patch because it seemed to do a little more damage. And I was using Flame Strike so much in Mythics that I felt like I was missing out not using Flame Patch. Every time you use Flame Strike, it just adds another Flame Patch. So you can end up with a fairly large area that is doing damage on the ground if you have a tank that moves mobs around quite a bit. Conflagration, for the life of me, I cannot get to work. It just does, the damage is so low, it just doesn't really make much of a difference. I've seen mages take this. I don't know. It's supposed to when you use Fireball, it's supposed to put basically a dot on them that will cause them to do additional damage periodically. It sounds really good. I don't use Fireball all that often, so that could be part of the problem with this. I've tried and tried and tried to use this, and for how I use the abilities for how my playstyle is, this just doesn't really do anything. Living Bomb, I can make it work. I can make work, and Flame Patch I can make work. Conflagration I cannot. So I keep swapping around these three, it seems like, every expansion to see if I'm missing something. And I either settle back on Flame Patch or I switch to Living Bomb. So Yeah. And then, as I said, I was using Flame Strike so much in Mythics that I felt like I was losing out on the damage. Again, as with as with what was I talking about earlier? When I figured out that Phoenix Flames would spread ignite and my damage went up. When I started using Flame Patch, my damage went up a noticeable amount, which I was a little surprised because I typically keep Living Bomb on cooldown. I used this leveling. I used it for part of the. I was gonna say, did I use it for part of the Covenant campaign? I think I did when I started out. And then when I started doing Mythics, I swapped over to Flame Patch. So I would say Flame Patch or Living Bomb would be a decent choice here. Conflagration, it just does really low damage. So if you don't use Fireball that often, it just doesn't seem like it does enough. It was one of those abilities in Battle for Azeroth that seemed like it suffered from the stat squish. It just did so low a damage that it almost did nothing at all. And then the last tier, I had and usually have taken Kindling. Basically, all your abilities reduce the cooldown of combustion by 1 second. Which is a bit redundant for me since I don't use combustion outside of boss fights usually. However, keeping it off cooldown is helpful. I had tried Meteor before, and my big complaint was the 3-second delay. However, in Mythics, AoE damage is important. Of course, you're on a clock, so Meteor kind of helps with keeping my DPS up and trying to get through the mobs as quickly as possible to focus on the boss fights. The 45-second cooldown, the 3-second delay isn't great. There's been few times, albeit, where this landed and it just didn't really hit anything. So has Flame Patch, for that matter. However, the damage is pretty decent. It leaves a dot on as well. So this is pretty much what I'll use on mob fights. And then I will swap between using, and then on boss fights I'll use combustion. So I kind of have two different abilities for each situation, and I kind of liked that. Pyroclasm basically works the opposite of combustion. If you were to use Pyroblast while you did not have a hot streak, there we go. It has a chance to increase the damage that it does. I never use Pyroblast when I don't have a hot streak. I don't know why I would. There's no need to not use it when you don't have a hot streak. It's easy enough to get a hot streak. My critical strike has been pretty well at about 30% or more for most of the time that I've been level 60, or at least for most of the time that I have been doing Mythics. And that is more than enough to get hot streaks. So, hot streaks, of course, are getting 2 direct critical strikes in a row with fire spells will make your next Pyroblast or Flame Strike spell instant cast and cause double the normal ignite damage. So there you go. So it kind of, like I said, you can put Living Bomb where I have Meteor, and that's arguably a more fun way to play fire. Um, this, I think, is the more efficient way. Flame Patch is making an ability I already have better, which is what I like to do, what I typically prefer to do. And then Meteor just gives me a little bit of extra damage. So the 45-second cooldown isn't great. I think 30 seconds would be perfectly fine and you wouldn't notice because you're still adding 3 seconds. So it's really 33 seconds. Or lower this to 42 seconds to factor in the 3-second delay. You don't get to use this as often as you'd like. Which then, that's where having to use Frost Nova comes in and spam Flame Patch because the mobs are moving or the tank is moving to move out of something depending on what the modifiers are in that week for Mythics. So it works, it just still works kind of as an oddball ability. I guess you could say works better in PvE than it did in PvP, which makes sense. I first tried this in PvP and I should have known it wasn't going to work that well, for obvious reasons. It was the delay that was the problem. You could use this in PvP, depending on what your playstyle with fire was. I just didn't seem to have much luck with it. So I preferred Kindling and I think it was Flame Patch, and yeah. So there you go. So as you can see, I have went over these quite a bit. So as far as my actual rotation, as I said, I will usually start out with Fire Blast. If it's a mob fight, I'll use maybe 1 or 2 charges of Phoenix Flames to spread my Ignite damage. Spam Flame Strike whenever possible. Use Meteor if it's a tough mob fight. If it's more elite, bigger mobs we're trying to fight, I'll go ahead and use Meteor. If it's smaller, just kind of trash mobs that you can pretty well AoE down fairly easily, I won't bother. There's no saying they're even going to be alive by the time the 3 seconds is up, so there's just really no point in going through the whole 45-second cooldown. Typically use my class ability on boss fights first, and then I'll use Mirror Image and Combustion. And then I do use Phoenix Flames when I have Combustion up, just because it doesn't get the critical strike effect. And there's really usually nowhere to spread Ignite to, so there's no point in trying to. So I'll use Phoenix Flames and then just kind of go back and forth with these two. Using Fireball as a filler when these are on cooldown. I'll occasionally throw Meteor out just for the extra damage. I don't really use Alter Time, as I said. And I think that's pretty much it. Occasionally use Dragon's Fire, as I said, or Dragon's Breath, as I said. I've tried using Arcane Explosion. It just doesn't work all that well for fire. I tend to run out of mana for my regular spells, so it doesn't do a whole lot of good. And then of course I don't use Scorch at all in Mythics or anything. There's just no point. If I could, I also don't use Frostbolt that often either. Now that I'm done leveling, I mainly only use this exclusively for the slow. I would use this first and then use my fire abilities to try to get a hot streak. And doing that, depending on where your damage is at, where your gear is at, you can almost kill a target before it reaches you, depending on how far um, you are. Frostbolt does have a 40-yard range, so I mean that's a fairly decent distance. Um, if I could, um, focus on anything, it'd probably be to get my mastery up a little higher. I feel like it hasn't been. My mastery and my haste have been lacking. For some reason, I've had high critical strike for, like I said, for quite a while. It's usually been around 30%, give or take. Since Ignite stacks, if the effect is reapplied, any remaining damage is applied to the new Ignite. That probably is what I'll focus on next, is trying to build my mastery up a little more. At least to, I would say, 20%. Typically, if you can even out your stats to 15-20%, you usually will do pretty good damage for some reason. I don't know why. Since stats generally don't work off each other necessarily. They do work together because they all affect your spells, your abilities, whatever they may be. And then haste just for fireball, basically. That's the one real drawback with fireball, is the almost 2-second cast time. I did somewhat figure out a remedy for that. So the theory crafting part of this would be, so I did, when I got to level 60, I did the time walking event for that week. I did world quests. I did the Covenant campaign, and then I did heroics. And I think I did, yeah, I think I did it in that order. I did time walking, I did world quest, heroic dungeons, and then once I got all my campaign gear, I ended up just upgrading all of that because I realized it was equally as good eye level gear as I was going to get in heroic. So, and since the common complaint on my monk was that my gear was too low, I made it a point that if I wanted to do mythics on my mage, that I was going to be as geared as I could be. Don't know that I've had any easier time. I've had no one say anything about my gear. So, at least there's that. I guess there's a small victory in there. So, I pretty well had everything upgraded to about 190 something, if not 200. The only thing that I didn't get upgraded were my trinkets for some reason. Trinkets just didn't seem to drop. Actually, I had rare trinkets. They were blue trinkets. So I looked at trinkets that dropped from dungeons. And I either wanted something that had versatility, because that seemed to work well during assaults to um, help with self-healing a little bit. I'm not sure if something changed. Um, I was under the impression that versatility gave you a portion of your damage back as healing. For some reason, I have looked this up. It does not anymore, and nor can I find anywhere where it said that it did. It does reduce damage taken, which still in a roundabout way would help with health. However, it seemed to really work well um, as a fire mage in Battle for Azeroth. As I said, doing assaults mostly was where I used it. I had a trinket um, that I think I even kept it. I had this trinket, which would increase my versatility, which seemed to work really well doing assaults. So I wanted something that would either heal or grant versatility. There are no trinkets in Shadowlands that grant you um, versatility for some reason. So when I went through and looked, I was looking at the the ones I had kind of narrowed down. Um, was the other side drops a trinket that has a random effect. I think this changes based on your based on either your um, kind of what your role is, or what kind of um, what kind of class you are. I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't find a clear answer. All I found was this had one of several effects. I got this on my hunter, and it actually increases versatility. However, I think for a caster class like a mage, I think it increases intellect. I think, if I remember right when I looked it up. So if you get it on one character, there's no guarantee that whatever the effect is, it's going to work on another character. It doesn't even actually tell you what it does on my hunter. This is what it actually shows you. I actually had to use it to figure out that it gave increased versatility. So there was that. There was Sanguine Depths, which increased intellect, and critical strike. So I thought, okay, that's good. Theater of Pain is where Soul Letting Ruby drops from. This is one I wanted because it actually does healing. So you actually have a heal, and it increases critical strike, and it has an intellect stat. So I thought, okay, all three good. Halls of Atonement drops Sunblood Amethyst, which does shadow damage, increases intellect, and has haste as the stat. And then Spires of Ascension does arcane damage and increases intellect and has mastery as a stat. So what I ended up getting was, or settling on to try to get, was Sunblood Amethyst and Soul Letting Ruby. These were the two that I had finally settled on. I had settled on Soul Letting Ruby because it actually did direct healing. And I got it first, and then I was actually trying to get the one from Sanguine Depths, because I thought, okay, two things that give intellect are an increased critical strike are pretty good for most, at least for fire. And then I came to the conclusion that, and then I started to run Spires of Ascension. I said, well, to do something else, because doing these as Mythic, if you do them as Mythic Zeros, you can only run them once a week. And then you can only run them so many times as Mythic 2, 3, before it just starts to get kind of dull. And you're only getting loot from the last boss. So the entire dungeon's kind of up for grabs, which odds-wise, I don't know if that's the most efficient way to farm gear. I did get both of these from... I guess from Mythic 0. I was going to say, I thought I got it from like Mythic 2s. But they're only upgraded to 1. I don't know that that's necessarily the most efficient way of getting gear. I was also doing the... If we come over to raids... I was also doing Morgoth, the rare in the Maw. Also drops a trinket that has a mastery stat and increases intellect. So I thought, okay, well, if nothing else, this would work just as well. As I could live with a mastery and a kind of a healing trinket. That would work as well. As you see, I got the 2 trinkets I wanted. Did take a few weeks. I just kept running the same dungeons. Like I said, I would try to run them as Mythic 0 since you can only run them once, and then I would try to run one or both as, either a Mythic +2, +3, or +4, depending on what was available. And then I looked after I got Soul Letting Ruby. I looked and thought, well, okay, I kind of realized I need to increase my haste. And I actually like that idea because haste works really well for Frost. Critical Strike and haste work really well for Arcane. Arcane's more of a mastery mastery spec. However, I thought it'll still help. It won't be a disadvantage necessarily. So it kind of evens out my stats for all 3 specs instead of just focusing on Critical Strike for mainly 1. So that's when I looked and realized that Halls of Atonement gave the Sunblade Amethyst, and ran this for a few weeks. And I think all totaled, I maybe had to run Theater of Pain and Halls of Atonement together. I think it took me maybe 6 weeks, give or take, to get both of these. So not a terrible amount of time. So I'm running each one. I was focusing on Theater of Pain first, so I was running it maybe 2-3 times a week. Same thing with Halls of Atonement after that, maybe 2-3 times a week. So I don't think that's terrible. I haven't upgraded anything yet. I was waiting to see kind of how they work first. Sunletting Ruby, the healing's not as great as I would have hoped. However, it is something. As I said with the trinket that I used in Battle for Azeroth with versatility, you want to use it when your health starts to go down, not when it starts to get to a critical point. Same thing with this. You want to use it when you notice your health getting to, 80, maybe 70%. Then you want to use it just to help your healer, depending on your tank and the rest of your class. You're a range class, or I'm a range class, so I'm not really usually a healing priority. I'm not standing in anything usually. I'm not within melee range of anything. I can usually dodge things quicker. So having a little bit of a self heal is better than nothing. I was a little disappointed after all the effort it took to get it that it didn't heal a little better. And that may change when I upgrade it. If I have to upgrade one of these two, it's probably going to be the Sun letting Ruby first. It'll be this one. The haste just from this is, as you see, it's 24, has helped tremendously. It gives Fireball a more reasonable cast time. I think without this, it becomes... I think this is like a 2-second cast time. I'm not entirely sure. It's a very slower cast time for sure. So, with my haste at 24%, which is not terribly difficult to get to, Fireball becomes a lot more usable in my rotation now. Every time it fails to critical, it will gain a stacking increase to critical strike, and then it consumes the effect once it does. So, I think this was the right choice to try to get both of these. And then the extra shadow damage is helpful. The intellect is helpful. I'll typically use this on boss fights if I want to do extra damage. I'll save the Bloodletting Ruby for, as I said, until my health goes down a little bit more. It's not worth having the extra critical strike until then. And yeah. So there you go, folks. There's abilities, talents, a little bit of theory crafting with the trinkets. As I said, if I could change something or work on something, it's probably going to be to get my mastery up a little higher just so Ignite can stack more. I feel like that's what's affecting my DPS right now. If I can get that a little higher, at least 20% is my goal, and then we'll go from there. I feel like my damage would be a little more on par. Haven't done terrible, depending on who else was in the group. I've done better than some other mages that have been in the group, and I've done maybe just when the dungeon was done and I looked at recount, I was maybe just right below another mage. Haven't actually seen too many other fire mages, which is a bit peculiar considering the fire mage is considered really good right now. Arcane is just kind of arcane. It's always kind of in this kind of gray zone between being not great but not terrible. Frost is usually a decent option. It's easy to play. It's good for single target and AoE. I've seen a lot of those. I haven't seen a lot of other fire mages, surprisingly, because I kind of wanted to see what my damage would be versus another fire mage. And I've either been more or less on par, maybe just a slight percentage off according to recount, or as I said, maybe I finished a little higher on a boss fight or something like that. So I don't know if they're just not using their cooldowns. Most of all, most of Mage's abilities or specs have pretty good cooldowns. Arcane being more of the oddball spec, but that's kind of what its theme is. So, yeah. So there you go, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope that was helpful for you. And thank you for watching.